desert setting with a liberation movement being joined by an outsider has become quite a frequent trope in Hollywood these days. Frank Herbert introduced us to the sandy seas of Arrakis in the 1960s, and to say that his work has had a massive impact on literature worldwide would be an understatement. The Dune franchise spans dozens of novels, from Frank's original award-winning 6-book series to the expansive and controversial continuation penned by his son Brian Herbert with Kevin J. Anderson. In this video, we'll be ranking every single book in this saga and giving you a tier list that reflects our thoughts and our thoughts only. If you disagree with where we've placed some of these books, let us know in the comments down below, and just to be clear, we won't be ranking the short stories in this video. We're ready to get on into it, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Alright, let's dive on in. 25. Special mention, Putnam's Dune Encyclopedia. Let's start off an official ranking list by talking about a book that's been declared non-canon, shall we? Trust us, if this book were still canon, it would be a lot higher on our list, simply because there's so many cool details hidden within. The Dune Encyclopedia was a unique companion guidebook released shortly after God Emperor of Dune. It featured contributions from 42 literary professors and other luminaries from the field, all of whom expanded upon the rich world-building provided by Frank Herbert. Dr. Willis E. McNally, the chief contributor, seems to have a deep understanding of the universe that Herbert has constructed, because the detail that's hidden within this gem is out of this world. The Dune Encyclopedia has notes on the entire family tree of the Atreides and the Hearkinins, the several regimes of Padishah emperors, the technology used in the Duneverse, and even a first contact event. Frank himself found the book to be a fascinating venture in expanding his established lore, and while he said that he kept his own counsel on some of the things written in it, he otherwise approved of it wholeheartedly. It was only after his son Brian took over the writing of the franchise that the Dune Encyclopedia was officially declared non-canon, and from that day forward, whatever he and Kevin J. Anderson wrote was considered the official canon. It's a damn shame that they couldn't come to some sort of agreement to canonize the Dune Encyclopedia, because it really is fascinating. You might be able to find a copy of it somewhere online if you want to see for yourself, but if you do manage to find it, you didn't get that info from us. 24. The Winds of Dune, 2009. The 2009 novel Winds of Dune is one of the weakest offerings of the series, and you'll soon see why. Set between the events of Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, it focuses on Lady Jessica's reactions to her son's supposed demise at the end of Messiah. Winds follow Jessica as she visits Arrakis before the visit chronicled in Children of Dune, years before Aaliyah fully succumbs to her abomination status. When she gets there, she sees the signs of the abomination in her daughter, but she doesn't act on it, which leads to the events of Children. Winds of Dune also has a major subplot that features her son Paul using his childhood friend Bronso Vernius to combat his own lethal message in secrecy. This is mostly told to us through flashback, which is basically a cheat code for retconning things into established canon. The main reason Winds of Dune ranks so low on our list is because of what it represents. Winds is probably the Dune book that holds the rank for worst interquel of all time, because while it covers significant ground, it doesn't really change anything. As a matter of fact, it almost demeans Frank's established chronology in favor of a narrative that his son employs in later epics to establish some sort of connection between Paul's reign and Leto's. In Frank's original series, Paul and Leto are supposed to be complete opposites, with their stories representing what happens when a person rejects and accepts their destiny respectively. A major theme of Children of Dune is the spotlight the story throws on this distinction, with Paul preaching about his own religion throughout the novel. The second installment of the Heroes of Dune series undermines much of that philosophical richness in favor of epic political action, and that's just not what the series was originally about. Keeping that in mind, we're placing Winds of Dune at the bottom of our list, but its predecessor wasn't much better. 23. Paul of Dune, 2008. The Brian Herbert interquels were designed to fill gaps between Frank Herbert's original novels as a means of answering some frequently asked questions about the transition phase between each novel. The time gaps keep getting bigger and bigger as you read Frank's work, and the Dune fandom has always been curious about what happened in the middle. However, many of these works are hyper-focused in and around the timeline of the first 3 novels, which was much tighter than anything else Herbert wrote. Between Dune and Dune Messiah, there was a 12-year gap, and between Messiah and children, around 15 years passed. It's only after these books that the time jumps start getting ridiculous, like 3.5 millennia between Children of Dune and God Emperor of Dune, or the millennium and a half between God Emperor and Heretics of Dune. From a chronological perspective, these time periods would offer a much richer tapestry for storytelling because we truly don't know what exactly happened when Leto became emperor or when humanity exploded to the stars. But Brian sticks to telling the story of the Atreides family, presumably because it's easier and because he's got a bit of a thing for lionizing Paul. A lot of his work is dedicated to making Paul, Jessica, and Leto a lot more adventurous and actionable than Frank had established them as being, but in doing so, he's been criticized for their placement and execution. Fans feel that the Brian Herbert novels are weirdly placed, being one-offs taking place in between Frank's books and lacking momentum, which is certainly the case with Paul of Dune. It's divided into two major parts, one set during Paul's childhood and the other during his time as emperor. It's the second half that sets off major alarm bells when it comes to continuity. Paul of Dune claims that the Fremen were not the first race to find Arrakis and shows us artifacts from the race that actually did. It also tells us that Aaliyah got her nickname, Saint Aaliyah of the Knife, by killing the daughter of Margot Fenring, who was bred to assassinate Paul. This assassination attempt on Paul is nearly a success, and Brian uses the most bizarre method to save him from death. He makes him undergo a second Water of Life ritual, which, if it followed established lore, should have supercharged all of Paul's abilities, but as far as we can tell, it doesn't. It's inconsistencies like these that make OG Dune fans reject the extended Dune novels entirely, but we'd say the only redeeming quality about Paul of Dune is that it answers the Tleilaxu questions satisfactorily. In Dune Messiah, we're told that the Tleilaxu created a Kwisatz Haderach of their own, but their Kwisatz ended up killing himself. That man was Thalo, and we meet him in Paul of Dune. We see exactly what leads to his demise, and it's by far the most interesting thing about this novel. Apart from Thalo, everything else feels like forced world building, and that's the worst thing you can do for an established IP like Dune. 22. Hunters of Dune, 2006. Apart from writing several prequel and interquel novels, Brian Herbert also wrote the direct sequels to Frank Herbert's final Dune book in an attempt to conclude the original saga. Frank had planned to release a 7th Dune novel to close out the many strands he'd opened in Chapter House, and Brian and co-author Kevin J. Anderson claimed that the sequels were based on a 30-page outline they found in Frank's personal notes. While some readers appreciate the closure they provided, many hardcore fans rejected them because they felt the sequels didn't capture the philosophical depth of the original works. And we've got to agree with them, because Hunters of Dune is as far as a novel can get from the intricate philosophy that was cultivated by Frank Herbert. The main distinction between the father and the son is that one thought of things on an extremely deep level, while the other has taken a more action-adventure approach. Frank was not afraid of alienating his audience by writing an entire novel from the perspective of a god, because to him, the philosophical message was more important. You might think that God Emperor of Dune was the pinnacle of his commentary on religion, but it's continued in Heretics and Chapter House, only from a different angle. The Brian Herbert novels, however, don't focus on religious engineering and its effects on the universe nearly as much as the original novels do. And when you have audiences specifically recommending the audio versions of Hunters of Dune and Sandworms of Dune because the narrator really knows how to keep your attention, that's basically them telling you your writing put them to sleep. Hunters is a set-up novel that mostly lays the groundwork for Sandworms of Dune. It often feels like a drag, and the fact that they create golas of so many historical figures on a ship that's supposed to be under-resourced and being pursued by superior beings is just too much of a stretch for us. Now, we aren't going to say that Brian and Kevin made everything up, but we will say that there is a noticeable disconnect between their work and Frank's, and it's not a good thing for novels that are supposed to be direct sequels. 21. Sandworms of Dune, 2007. The only reason that Sandworms of Dune wins out over Hunters is because it actually concludes the series. At the end of Hunters of Dune, we learn that the enemy that's hunting humanity and driving them towards extinction is none other than the thinking machines. Daniel and Marty are revealed to be Omnius and Erasmus, and it's revealed that they've basically taken over the entire lost Tleilaxu civilization by flipping their face dancers. Now, they're using these face dancers to infiltrate human colonies so they can finish the job they began 10,000 plus years ago. The brilliant plan to prevent this from happening is to somehow get all surviving sandworms to magically produce more melange or create genetically altered sandworms, and that, at least, is an extremely interesting plot point. The concept of genetics dominates much of the Dune franchise, and it was somewhat inevitable that someone would try to alter the sandworms genetically at a certain point in time. Frank came up with too many secret societies of geneticists for that not to have been the case. But where Sandworms falls flat for us is the fact that it uses bailout after bailout to clean up the ending, and its climactic scene is basically Paul fighting himself. Norma Senva is introduced to the main stories as the godlike Oracle of Time who basically wins Arafel all by herself. Then, Erasmus betrays Omnius and all his face dancer subordinates and merges minds with Duncan Idaho, who turns out to be the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach. The final scene of Sandworms of Dune shows Paul and Chani on Arrakis finally being able to have the relationship they didn't have, with Paul telling her he's loved her for 5,000 years. And while that is a happy ending, we don't feel like it's quite right. Frank Herbert was clearly positioning Daniel and Marty to be Tleilaxu face dancers from the lost Tleilaxu civilization. Feels like Brian and Kevin shifted their role to Crone, and the fact that Crone, a man who had broken through a mental conditioning program perfected for millennia, was gullible enough to fall prey to a kill switch, you see what we mean, right? Sandworms of Dune creates immense dissonance in relation to Frank's original work, and that's why it ranks so low on our list, despite being, quote-unquote, the last Dune novel. 20. The Heir of Kaledan, 2022. Up next is perhaps one of the most recent and, quite frankly, one of the best-written Brian Herbert Dune novels out there. The Kaledan trilogy is set a few years before the Atreides family is given the fiefdom of Arrakis and attempts to flesh out their competency, as is the theme with many Brian and Kevin Dune novels. The first couple of Kaledan books focuses on Leto and Jessica, each of whom have a mission that takes them away from Kaledan. In the final novel of the trilogy, we see their heir, a young Paul Atreides, struggle with his ducal duties while his parents attempt to save the universe from a major threat. While the first couple of novels are enjoyable reads by themselves, Heir of Kaledan suffers from the same problem that many final books in a series do, closing out too many plot threads. On top of having too many plot threads, it introduces several subplots that have no effect on established canon or just straight up deviate from it. In Heir of Kaledan, Paul has a bit of a puppy love situation going on with a girl, which doesn't make a lot of sense because everything about Frank's Dune novels have led us to believe that Chani was the first and really only love of his life. But if we start nitpicking contradictions from the extended Duneverse, we'll be here all day. So let us just say this. If you love Paul Atreides and Fade Routha and all the characters from the Villeneuve movies, then you might want to check this one out because they're all there. If not, Heir of Kaledan isn't exactly what we would call essential reading. 19. The Lady of Kaledan, 2021. Next up is Brian and Kevin's second novel to feature Jessica as the main character, the Lady of Kaledan. This novel focuses on the fallout that Jessica has to face because of her decision to give birth to Paul, and it's an interesting exploration of her psychology and the Bene Gesserit tendency to shame until the last possible second. Jessica's penance in their eyes entails bringing the wealth of a sponsor back to them, while they send Leto to another concubine to ensure Jessica doesn't reunite with Paul. As we all know, that doesn't happen, and in fact, this isn't even the first time Brian and Kevin have used the other women getting in the middle of the Duke and his lady trope, but what it is their best version of it. Both writers have clearly matured as storytellers, and Lady of Kaledan's crisp, action-packed narrative is the best example of it. It's a far cry from Winds, but if you're a fan of Rebecca Ferguson, then you should definitely pick this one up. But even in comparison to their own bibliography, it fails to stand up to some of their earlier work for reasons we'll get into later on. 18. The Duke of Kaledan, 2020. And now, the final installment of the Kaledan trilogy, and the one we'd probably recommend you read irrespective of what your opinions on Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson are, simply because it showcases a man who is criminally underrated, Duke Leto Atreides, the father of Muad'Dib and grandsire of the God Emperor. Brian and Kevin have invested a lot of time in making Leto feel like a competent force to be reckoned with within the Imperium, a man who has stepped aside the usual treacherous ways of the Imperium to make an honorable name for himself. Of course, in the first Dune novel, Leto admits that all of this is just Atreides propaganda, but propaganda works best when it's rooted in reality, and Duke of Kaledan gives us a bit of that reality. It sets up Leto's story arc throughout the trilogy, which is to gain the favor of Emperor Shaddam without getting caught up in a scheme that can expose his family to expulsion from the Imperium. At first, Leto thinks about going through with a subterfuge, but then he decides the best way to achieve his goal is to put down a rebellion with a dangerous planetary-level threat. The Kaledan trilogy's main focus is Leto's stopping of this rebellion, which leads to him being rewarded with Arrakis. Dune of Kaledan is the first and, in our opinion, best novel of the three because it truly feels fresh and intriguing at points. And if you have no idea what Dune is all about, it's a great place to start. 17. The Princess of Dune, 2023. Another great starting point for those of you who have just seen the Villeneuve movies is The Princess of Dune, which features two of your favorite characters in the spotlight, Princess Irulan and Chani. In Princess, set before Paul assumes the Golden Lion throne, Irulan Corino must stop a mutinous, disgraced general from taking out her father because they're dissatisfied with the regime. Said general has valid reasons for hating Shaddam, of course, because he's the absolute worst, but surprisingly, he appears rather competent at the beginning of Princess. As Irulan uncovers and makes progress towards foiling his plot, Chani deals with her split loyalties between her father, the planetary ecologist Liet Kynes, and her half-brother, who sees their father as being the Emperor's creature. This struggle is placed within the background of increasing Fremen raids on Hearkinin harvesters and patrols, which creates a decent setting for such a deeply personal struggle to play out. Princess of Dune's main selling point is that it does not feature a single Atreides. Instead, it focuses on the two women who come to define the Atreides bloodline, and that break really allowed Brian and Kevin to tell a new story. Chani especially feels a lot more like her movie counterpart, so if you liked Zendaya's portrayal of her, Princess of Dune is a decent enough starting point. This brings us to the conclusion of the bad part of our video. Now let's move on to the average, starting with 16. Navigators of Dune, 2016. The Great Schools of Dune series receives middling ranks in most lists, and that isn't without good reason. While these books explore interesting concepts about the formation of the organizations that shape the Dune universe, they don't generate the same enthusiasm as Frank's originals or even Brian and Kevin's Prelude trilogy. That's probably because they favor action-adventure over deep philosophical discussions about life itself and how material things can ruin human existence. Still, what they give us in terms of the backstory for the Suk School, the Guild of Navigators, the School of Mentats, and the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood has become so integral to the canon that Dune Prophecy is based on these books. Navigators of Dune was the final novel in the Great Schools trilogy and adventured the furthest into the creation of the most secretive organization in all of Dune, the Spacing Guild. In it, we learn how the discoverer of fold space technology monopolized it for the Guild, which was presented as a massive deal in Frank's original work. Being the only people allowed to regulate space travel, the Guild holds all human transportation in their hands, and that makes them just as powerful as the Bene Gesserit or even the Emperor himself. While the story itself is decent enough, Navigators suffers from the same problem that many of Brian and Kevin's series' concluding books do, which is the overuse of the Deus Ex Machina trope. Norma Senva's ascension to godhood is presented within this novel as the formative experience for the Spacing Guild, and her integration into the official conclusion of the series still doesn't sit right with us. Still, there are many interesting details about the Spacing Guild's formation in Navigators of Dune, which makes it a worthy read. 15. Sisterhood of Dune. The Sisterhood of Dune was the first novel in the Great Schools trilogy, and it mostly served as a setup, which is why we've placed it here. In this novel, we see the reconstruction of the sorceresses of Rossack into the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood as the predecessor to the Spacing Guild gears up for war against an anti-technology movement. We also follow the tale of the Butlerian Jihad hero and progenitor of the Atreides-Hearkinin rivalry, Vorian Atreides, as he grapples with the many mistakes he's made during his long life. Vorian probably doesn't even know that his granddaughter, Raquel Berto Anarul, has become the proto-reverend mother by consuming the Rossack drug, but he'll come to find out soon that the Hearkinin thirst for revenge runs deeper than he could have ever thought. There's a brief section touching upon the peoples that evolve into the Fremen during the main section, and for the most part, Sisterhood of Dune does a decent job of establishing everything Brian and Kevin aim to address with the Great Schools trilogy. The only reason it ranks lower than the second book is because, well, that's where most of the action is. 14. Mentats of Dune, 2014. Mentats of Dune is, in our opinion, the best novel from the Great Schools trilogy for two big reasons. It has an actually clever assassination plot in it, and it's where two of the most important killings from Dune Prophecy occur. Now, yes, we will admit our opinions are slightly colored because we like Dune Prophecy on this channel, but Mentats of Dune tackles the history of that series with more nuance, which is something you can't often say about the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson books. Mentats has a fragmented storyline, focusing on the many factions of the Duneverse, but its main focus can be divided into 4 parts. The first is the titular section, focusing on the founder of the Mentat school, Gilbertus Albans, and how he tries and fails to escape the anti-technology movement whilst harboring a key part of the Evermind. The second part is all about the Emperor, who seizes spice production on Arrakis and thus makes an enemy out of the Spacing Guild's central authorities, who end up assassinating him. The third part focuses on the ascendancy of Valia and Tula Hearkinin within the newly established Bene Gesserit Mother School on Wallach 9. And the final part shows Valia's vengeance on House Atreides and Vorian's discovery of it. Each part is suspenseful, tense, and action-packed, and some of the moments that occur in Mentats genuinely made us think about things the way Frank's novels do. That's why Mentats is, in our opinion, Brian and Kevin's finest work post-2010. 13. The Machine Crusade, 2003. The Legends of Dune trilogy ranks slightly higher than the Schools trilogy in our books, simply because they did something all Dune fans had been asking for. They gave us insight into the Butlerian Jihad, a formative event in Dune's history. These books detail the ancient war against thinking machines that shaped the technologically suppressed, theologically oppressed Dune universe. The fact that these books take place over 10,000 years before the birth of Paul Atreides is an inherently inviting premise. It also gives Brian and Kevin the most room to tell their own story, as the Legends trilogy definitely benefits from being set so far from the original timeline. Much of its contents don't conflict with Frank's established narrative because that narrative doesn't exist in terms of Dune's history, which is why the Legends prequels work. The Machine Crusade puts us in the middle of the protracted war against thinking machines and has all the hallmarks of a classic Dune novel. But what we really liked about it was the fact that it answered the question of Fremen migration in a way that makes sense and doesn't cheapen their culture. Also, turns out the Fremen were amongst the first people to use a guild highliner, go figure. The Machine Crusade is also notable for the creation of the first Mentats, the Sword Masters of Ginaz, the iconic Lasgun Holtzman shield explosion, and fold space technology. Many key concepts from the Duneverse were elaborated upon in this series, which is why, if you're interested in lore, we'd definitely recommend reading the Legends trilogy. The Machine Crusade is the second book in the series, and next up is 12. The Butlerian Jihad, 2002. This is the first novel from the Dune franchise to not feature any of the original cast of characters, primarily because it takes place thousands of years before Paul Atreides is even conceived. The Butlerian Jihad is the first in a series of 3 novels that shaped our understanding of the ancient history of Dune. Now, most people might not agree with this history, seeing as it didn't come from Frank himself. However, Brian and Kevin maintain that everything they've created since his passing has come from a collection of over 1,000 notes that Frank wrote while he was fleshing out his universe, so we'll take them at their word since we can't prove otherwise. The Butlerian Jihad shows us how 3 people shaped the course of Imperial history and how their actions created the great houses and rivalries of the first novel's timeline. It also includes the incident that sparks the Jihad, the murder of an innocent child and the involuntary hysterectomy of its mother by a thinking machine, while explaining why it became a root cause of Fremen persecution. For decades, people wondered why the Fremen came to Arrakis of all places, and the Legends trilogy answers that question. Turns out, they thought that the Butlerian Jihad was the onset of Kralizak, aka the war to end all wars. So, they used ancient spacefaring technology to retreat to the unallied planets of the world, one of which was Arrakis. Any followers of the Buddha-Islamic faiths that chose to remain in the League of Nobles were enslaved by both human and machine. Machines enslaved them because that was their nature, but humanity saw their pacifist stance as a betrayal of their race. This began the long history of the Zen-Sunni migration, which is sort of completed within these novels as well, but we'll discuss that in a separate video. The seeds of the Atreides-Hearkinin rivalry are also laid bare in the Butlerian Jihad, so overall, we'd say that this book has earned its spot in our ranking. But as important as it is, the final installment of this trilogy is arguably even more so. 11. The Battle of Corin, 2004. The Battle of Corin is the epic conclusion to the Legends of Dune prequel series, and yes, we said epic because this novel pretty much lays the foundations for everything that happens from that point forward, including the conclusion that Brian and Kevin wrote for Frank's series. The Battle of Corin is the battle where the Butlerian Jihad's first family formally sheds that name. Serena Butler, the woman whose child was killed in cold blood by the thinking machines, has become a revered saint and martyr at this point. Humanity's hatred for thinking machines, anything that curbs their individualism, has reached fever pitch, and it has ironically turned them into a murderous mob. The leaders of humanity's military have struck back against the machines, but neither side was able to score a decisive victory. Then, Norma Senva discovers fold space technology and changes the universe forever. Humanity also learns that the spice melange can counter the effects of the Omnius Scourge, a lethal virus engineered by the machines to render humanity extinct. Norma's tech and spice consumption allows humans to overwhelm the machines, despite the Scourge rampaging through their population, and humanity scores a decisive victory against the Evermind at their capital planet, Corin. The Butler family takes the name Corino after this victory, and the first Corino Emperor ascends to the Golden Lion throne. The foundation of the Spacing Guild, the use of spice as a miracle drug, the Bene Gesserit, the Sook School, Chom, the Landsrod, all of it is laid down retroactively through the Battle of Corin, making it one of the most crucial reads from the extended Dune universe. The scope and scale is reminiscent of Frank's epic sagas, and while it might lack philosophical depth, it makes up for that with intricate plot lines that actually lead somewhere. 10. Dune, House Atreides, 1999. The prelude to Dune novels are generally considered Brian Herbert's best contribution to the Duneverse, likely because they were the first new Dune material to come out in close to 2 decades. These books explore the generation before the original Dune, featuring Duke Leto Atreides, Baron Vladimir Hearkinin, and most importantly, Crown Prince Shaddam Corino. Other great houses like House Vernius of Ix and House Fenring also play a role in the series, as do several other members of the Landsrod. Because Paul hasn't been born yet, he can't be the main character of this story. And he isn't. It's actually Leto, his father. House Atreides focuses on Leto Atreides' life, leading up to the moment he became the Duke of Kaledan. At the beginning of the novel, Leto is in Ix, where he's learning more about the world and culture as a guest of House Vernius. During his residence there, Ix is suddenly attacked by a joint force of Tleilaxu and Sardaukar, who proceed to conquer the planet in violation of the laws of the Landsrod. Leto barely escapes with a couple of Vernius kids and returns to his homeworld, where his mother, Helena Atreides, strongly objected to the kids' presence. Helena was a Rachesi, and House Rachesi had been exiled from Ix years prior. This set into motion the events that led to the Seleucid Bull killing Leto's father and him becoming Duke of Kaledan. Elsewhere, we touch upon the tales of Duncan Idaho and Pardot Kynes, 2 men who would go on to shape the course of history in their own ways. Also significant to the plot is Gaius Helen Mohiam's fruitless companionship with the Baron Vladimir Hearkinin and Shaddam's plot to become emperor with the help of his old buddy Count Fenring. If all of that sounds like something Frank Herbert would have written, that's a good thing, because that's one of the strengths of the Prelude series. Though it adds new elements to the established canon, none of them conflict with it in major or egregious ways. Apart from the fact that the Hearkinins had a no-ship before the no-ships existed, all the motivations of each character make sense, and Dune, House Atreides, is one of the better outings that Brian and Kevin have had, and it's definitely worth your time if galactic soap operas are your thing. 9. Dune, House Corino, 2001. The final installment of the Prelude series is pretty much an epic battle conclusion to the story threads that were laid down in House Atreides. In Dune, House Corino, Duke Leto Atreides solidifies his position as a threat to the Golden Lion throne by dealing with the Tleilaxu invasion of Ix. While he's off at war, his concubine, the Bene Gesserit's sister Jessica, is pregnant with his child back on Kaledan. The Sisterhood thinks that Jessica is carrying a daughter in her womb because she is still on mission. They don't know that in her heart, she's betrayed them and chosen to sire a son who will go on to become the Kwisatz Haderach. Shaddam Corino's plan to remove Arrakis from the center of universal trade and commerce fails spectacularly, but he's able to hide his involvement in it and save his seat of power. The Baron Vladimir Hearkinin puts into place the pieces that will go on to become the cause of the Fremen uprising in Dune, and the failure of Project Ajitamal becomes the basis for something that Tleilaxu would achieve centuries down the line. All in all, House Corino ties together plot threads from Frank's novels and its own predecessor issues rather nicely and is a good conclusion to the Prelude series, but it isn't the best in our opinion. That honor goes to 8. Dune, House Hearkinin, 2000. This novel represents the peak of Brian and Kevin's interpretation of Frank's work, in our opinion. It features some of the most defining lore moments that were left unaddressed in the original novels, like the confirmation of Jessica's parentage and the reason behind the Baron's grotesque appearance. Turns out both are connected to Gaius Helen Mohiam, and to say that that isn't in a good way would be an understatement. Let's just say that the Baron does something to Mohiam that makes her use her Bene Gesserit powers of biochemistry manipulation to inflict upon him a special disease. This disease is the cause for his corpulent appearance, and it's slowly rotting him from the inside out. The Baron takes his vengeance by getting his beast of a nephew to his side and unleashing the rabid Raban upon the Imperium. This is also the time he intensifies his philosophy of squeezing Arrakis for every fleck of spice and ending the line of House Atreides once and for all. Elsewhere, his daughter Jessica is presented to Duke Leto as his concubine, but things aren't going to be as simple as they were made to seem by Dune. Leto is tempted by the Tleilaxu with a choice similar to the one they presented to Chani in Dune Messiah, and just like his son, he chooses to reject it. Duncan Idaho is freed from the Hearkkinins, and by the end of this novel, so is Gurney Halleck. But the main reason we like Dune House Hearkinin so much is because it elaborated on Project Ajidamal, which was a rather sensible project for Shaddam to undertake. At this point in the story, spice has become the axis upon which the Imperium rotates, and yet its harvesting remains as dangerous as the day it was discovered, if not more so. The Sandworms and the Fremen always fight back, no matter which house holds the fief, and House Harkonnen's success was due in part to their extremely brutal tactics. Shaddam's idea to create a spice substitute was the smartest one he's had in the whole franchise, and Dune, House Harkonnen's pacing, is also quite compelling. If you want to check out anything from the extended Duneverse, it's this trilogy of books, and with that, we finally get to the good stuff and then the great. 7. The Road to Dune, 2005. If you're a Dune historian like we are, then The Road to Dune is the companion book for you because it contains a bunch of fascinating documents personally written by Frank Herbert himself. There's the alternate version of the first Dune novel called Spice Plane, written by Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson, based upon the original story outline that Frank made for Dune. It features House Lincoln, a version of House Atreides, temporarily taking control of Dune World from their rivals, House Hoskiner, the forerunner of the Hearkkinins, to settle a dispute between them. Much like in Dune, the Hoskiners sabotage and thwart to the best of their abilities, although the Lincolns enlist the help of the Imperial planetologist to devise a way to neutralize the Sandworms and vastly increase the efficiency of operations. According to Brian and Kevin, Spice Planet doesn't have the hardcore ecological focus of Dune, and that makes it a completely different story, one more about the dangers of drug addiction rather than mystical prophecy. There are also letters of correspondence between Frank and his editors from as far back as Dune days, and unused as well as revised chapters from Dune and Dune Messiah in this companion. Brian and Kevin round things out by including a few Dune short stories they've written into it, because of course, but that doesn't take away from this unique information presented to us in The Road to Dune. If you're a fan of Dune, you should probably check this one out, because Spice Planet is, in many ways, Brian and Kevin's best interpretation of Dune. 6. Heretics of Dune, 1984. Moving on to the section you've all been waiting for, the classics. Frank Herbert wrote 6 Dune novels in his lifetime, and he passed away before he could pen a planned 7th, but we think it's safe to say that nothing anyone connected to the Dune IP has written after Dune has been as compelling as Dune was. With that being said, Frank did love surprising his readers and keeping them on their toes, because so much happens between his novels that each of them can stand alone in a way. The Paul Atreides of Dune is not the Paul Atreides of Messiah, is not the Paul Atreides of Children. That said, in last place from the original series, at least for us, is Heretics of Dune. Set 1500 years after the reign of God Emperor Leto II, it thrusts readers into a universe transformed by the scattering, the mass dissemination of humanity across the universe. While the old powers attempt to maintain their position, new powers return and vie for dominance, most notably the honored Matres, a violent, sexually dominant group of female conquerors. In the meantime, the Tleilaxu put into motion a plan to take control of the universe from the shadows, and it all culminates with the destruction of the planet formerly known as Arrakis. Heretics of Dune revives the intrigue and court politics of the original Dune while exploring the consequences of Leto II's Golden Path. It examines the evolution of humanity in the aftermath of total and oppressive tyranny, the clash of ancient and emerging orders, and the fact that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Heretics highlights the enduring importance of adaptation and survival in a universe where nothing remains static. But reading it right after God Emperor can feel like you're switching gears mid-series. Apart from Duncan, Idaho, the entire cast of characters is new, and that is the biggest complaint that most people have with it. It can feel like a hard left turn when you read it for the first time, but after a few deep reads, you can see that Heretics is just as nuanced as its predecessor was. Yeah, it's a lot tougher to get into because Frank decides to just keep raising the stakes without telling us what they are, but we get where the people who think Heretics is his weakest work come from. 5. Chapter House Dune, 1985. Those same people might feel like the series was being stretched beyond its limits with Chapter House Dune, but we now know that it was actually building up to an explosive climax. And if you know anything about Frank Herbert's views on the pacing of Dune, you'll know that that was intentional. The final novel written by Frank Herbert picks up immediately after the destruction of Arrakis in Heretics. The Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, now led by Mother Superior Darwi Odrade, faces existential threat from the Honored Matres, who are ruthlessly exterminating their rivals and seeking to dominate the galaxy. With the last sandworm hidden on the Bene Gesserit homeworld, Chapter House, the Sisterhood works to terraform the planet into a new Dune, ensuring the survival of the spice and their own order. The narrative focuses on the Bene Gesserit's internal and external struggles, Odrade's attempts to outmaneuver the Honored Matres, the training of Shiana, who can control sandworms, and the integration of Merbella, a captured Honored Matre, into the Sisterhood. Duncan, Idaho, the ever-present manifestation of human individualism in Frank's stories, returns yet again in Gola form and plays a pivotal role in the novel's ending. As the Honored Matres close in on the Sisterhood, Odrade sacrifices herself in a final confrontation, paving the way for Merbella to unite the two rival sisterhoods as both Mother Superior and Great Honored Matre. Duncan, meanwhile, escapes the clutches of both organizations by boarding a ship called the Ithaca with Shiana, the Gola of Tleilaxu Master Scytale, a few other accomplices, and a few baby sandworms. The novel ends with the casting of the mysterious Tachyon Net and the introduction of Daniel and Marty, who were surprised that Duncan was able to see them. Chapter House Dune returns to the philosophical depth and complex character dynamics that made the first Dune novel famous, as it continues to discover the consequences of trying to control humanity's fate on a molecular level through the War of the Sisterhoods. It explores the merging of tradition and innovation, the ethical dilemmas of leadership, and the constant need for adaptation, themes that are ever present in Herbert's Dune novels. The transformation of Chapter House into a new Dune symbolizes renewal amid destruction, something Frank focuses on quite a bit. And though some readers find its pacing slow and its ending abrupt, Chapter House Dune nevertheless stands as a thought-provoking, albeit unintentional finale to Herbert's legendary saga. That is, if you don't count the extended Duneverse, of course. 4. Children of Dune, 1976. This third book in Frank Herbert's original series receives varied reactions from audiences because its subject matter is quite divisive. No author spends years building up a main character just to tear him down and expose him as a liar, but Frank Herbert did, and it produced some interesting results. Fan rankings often place Children of Dune above his second book, but we disagree, as you'll learn in a bit. Children of Dune is one of the most in-depth explorations of the concept of family and legacy within the backdrop of everything that Frank had already established in his first two novels. In it, the main characters are Paul Atreides' sister Alia, who has fallen prey to abomination and taken over the reins of the Atreides Empire as its regent, his mother Jessica, who returns to Arrakis to look after her family to the best of her abilities, and his twin children, Yanima and Leto II. Paul himself appears as a character called the Preacher, who preaches against all the false teachings of Muad'Dib as a man returned from the desert. Children of Dune's main story focuses on the plot to depose Alia, because with each passing day she becomes more like the man possessing her from her other memory, the Baron Vladimir Hearkinin. Jessica scatters Leto and Yanima to the wind to protect them from Alia, and assigns them both overseers, but it's the former who emerges as the true heir to the Atreides Empire and the Kwisatz Haderach program. One of the most important moments from Children of Dune is when Leto II meets his father out in the deep deserts of Arrakis and discusses their shared burdens with him. At this point, Leto has unlocked perfect prescience, and he sees what Paul saw and beyond. He knows that in becoming Mahdi and then rejecting his seat, his father didn't take humanity down a certain path that is deemed to be necessary on an evolutionary level. Paul calls his son a monster at first for wanting to actually go through with the plan, but over the course of their conversation, relents and admits to his own weakness and his pride in Leto. The father-son duo then confronts Aaliyah, and Children of Dune ends with Leto II becoming the second and last Atreides Emperor of the Imperium. Children of Dune was divisive upon its release because its content was so far removed from the original books and it subverted so many expectations, but with each subsequent book it made more sense, and by the time Chapterhouse came out, it was given the respect it deserved. Children of Dune is number 4 in our top 4 Dune books, so let's get down to the top 3. Number 3. Dune Messiah, 1970. Dune Messiah, the much-anticipated sequel to Frank's Hugo and Nebula award-winning novel, remains the series' shortest book and was actually considered disappointing upon its release. However, many would strongly disagree with that statement today, simply because we now know the impact it had on the overarching mythos of the Duneverse. Dune Messiah picks up about 12 years after Paul becomes Emperor of the known universe, and if this were a conventional story, at this point in time, he'd be struggling with ruling judiciously. Instead, his main conflict is that he can no longer digest being a tyrant. Frank Herbert's main goal with the Dune series was to warn people against putting their trust in a single charismatic individual, and it seems like many missed this point when Messiah came out because they expected Paul to be front and center of the narrative. Instead, what it focused on was an assassination attempt on Paul's life, orchestrated by every major organization in the world, including his official wife, Irulan Corino. We find this storyline in particular to be extremely compelling because it explores Irulan's story without diminishing her as a character. Irulan might have only agreed to marry Paul out of an obligation to save her family, but at the end of the day, she too was a woman. Irulan resented the fact that Paul treated her like a wife only in name, with Chani enjoying all the actual benefits of being married to the Emperor. She doesn't like to phrase it as jealousy, but it is plain jealousy that leads her to start dosing Chani with infertility drugs. Of course, Paul's proposal to artificially inseminate Irulan also isolates his enemies further because artificial insemination is seen as a violation of the tenets of the Butlerian Jihad. And yet, that isn't even what makes Dune Messiah so striking. Throughout the novel, Paul survives multiple attempts on his life. He even gets blinded by a bomb, but is able to retain his position as Emperor and Mahdi of the Fremen Society by living his life perfectly in lockstep with his visions. With every action, Paul further ascends to the realm of legend, but the man within was dying of hypocrisy. His terrible purpose had proven itself to be all-consuming, and by the time Messiah comes to an end, that title becomes more ironic than literal. Paul's jihad had taken 64 billion lives and sterilized the surfaces of dozens of planets, and though it was foretold through prescience, Paul learned in his 12 years as Emperor that this was just the first step. To remake mankind and truly free them from the yoke of destiny, Paul would have to shed his own humanity, and that's something he could never do. His decision to take control of the Fremen itself stemmed from his human desire to avenge his father, so when he walks into the desert in accordance with Fremen tradition relating to blind men, he finally becomes a true Fremen by becoming an outcast. Dune Messiah likely didn't succeed commercially or critically at the time because it tackled a subject too subversive. What if a man takes a step towards what he believes to be his destiny, but sees that it will cost him everything that makes him him? That's just one of the few reasons we love Dune Messiah so much. 2. God Emperor of Dune, 1981. This philosophical fourth book in the original series often ranks very highly among dedicated fans, and rightly so. It's not every day that you get to see life from inside the head of a god. And yet that's exactly what God Emperor of Dune is all about, the lifetime and many tragedies of the last living human, Leto II. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, didn't Leto turn into a sandworm hybrid in Children of Dune? And the fact is, he did, but his perfect prescience also means that he has access to all of humanity that came before him, and so he's also the last true human. Leto is the only person living who properly remembers ancient Earth cities and languages and cultures, and he often dreams through those memories because it's his only link to his own humanity. Because you see, Leto is in fact not human anymore. When he decided to join with the Sandworm, he made the conscious decision to sacrifice his humanity. He knew the evolution process would be slow, but that ultimately he'd become more worm than man until the worm was all that remained. God Emperor of Dune finds Leto in quite an advanced stage of his metamorphosis as he engages in a mad scramble against his own men to keep together the delicate strands that guide his golden path. The fate that Paul rejected and his son accepted was this: to teach humanity the true importance of freedom, they'd have to break them first, and break them utterly. After ascending his father's throne, Leto began a period of 3,500 years of total subjugation, where he presented himself to humans as their emperor and their god. In secret, he worked on plans that would ensure his own downfall and that humanity would never again fall entirely to a tyrant like him. Leto even finds love at his most unloving stage in life, but the real tragedy of God Emperor of Dune is this: although Leto knows much of what is going to happen, he refuses to change his own fate, because otherwise he'd become a prisoner of destiny. Despite being all-knowing, Leto doesn't want to know when his own death will come for him, because he still wants to remain human. He gives his human subordinates grandiose lectures on human nature and the cyclical patterns that we keep repeating over the course of millennia, but his desperation for them to understand his views is in itself human. One of the best takes on God Emperor of Dune comes from a Reddit user who notes that when they first read it at about 15, they hated it, thought it was about as slow and dense as a glacier. 30 years later, it's their second favorite book, and we totally get why that's the case. God Emperor of Dune is not just a novel, it's a philosophical treatise given to us from a man who knows that he isn't God, not in that ultimate sense, but he pretends to be God anyways, because he knows that's how fickle human minds can be, and that's the real warning. Dune, 1965. And finally, we have the crown jewel of the franchise. Almost universally, across any Dune tier list you look for online, the first Dune novel will always be ranked at the top, because the original novel still stands as the series' masterpiece. With its complex world-building, philosophical depth, and highly engaging narrative, Dune remains the standard against which all other entries are measured. We can say many things about this novel, but those things have been said and resaid a million times over by so many people, we'll instead leave you with just our opinion. Dune is first by a million miles in this tier list, not because it was spawned from an ecology paper on sand dunes, but because it has a unique perspective on the hero's journey. It's first because it did something none of the other books managed to replicate on a similar level, to be as original and complete a body of work as is humanly possible. When you read Dune, you don't feel like too much has been left unsaid. Yes, there are some unanswered questions, and yes, there's intrigue, but you also feel like it's a full story, not just a part of something bigger. Dune is the single most important science fiction fantasy novel in our opinion, because it reshaped the way we think about humanity itself, and that's as rare as finding water on Arrakis. Marvelous verdict! The Dune franchise offers a vast reading experience spanning thousands of years of in-universe history. While Frank Herbert's original novel almost universally ranks at the top, opinions diverge significantly on the rest of the series, as you might have figured out from this video. But still, we've done our best to give you a ranking that we think does justice to this juggernaut of literature. But what do you think? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with your fellow Dune heads, because this isn't the last time we'll be revisiting the 1,000 planets of the Imperium. So until next time, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and don't sniff or lick any random powders you find out in the desert unless you're ready for the trip of your life.